My name is Rachel Bennett, and I am 38 years old. 3 months after my grandmother's funeral, my parents invited the entire family to Sunday dinner and announced that they were giving Grandma's house to my younger sister, Melissa. That should have been impossible because Grandma had spent the last 12 years telling everyone that the house would stay exactly as she wanted it. But that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was what my father said next. He looked around the table and smiled like the decision had already been approved by some invisible authority. Melissa needs the house more than anyone, he said, and your grandmother would have wanted family to help family. Everyone nodded, everyone except me, because I knew something they didn't. I knew exactly how much that house had cost over the past 12 years, and I knew who had paid those bills. It wasn't my parents, it wasn't Melissa, and it definitely wasn't anyone sitting at that table pretending this was a generous family decision. The house sat on almost 4 acres outside town. It had belonged to my grandparents for over 40 years. After Grandpa died, Grandma stayed there alone. The property taxes increased almost every year. The maintenance never stopped. The roof needed repairs. The plumbing failed twice. The heating system had to be replaced. Yet somehow everyone suddenly acted like the house had simply survived on good wishes and family love. Melissa sat beside my mother with tears in her eyes. "Oh my God," she said. "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." My mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "You deserve it." I remember looking around the room wondering if I was losing my mind. Because 12 years earlier, when Grandma's financial problems started, nobody had volunteered to help. Not my parents, not Melissa, not my uncles, not my cousins. Nobody. Back then, everyone had excuses. They had their own bills, their own families, their own problems. And somehow those excuses always disappeared when there was something valuable to inherit. The conversation continued while I sat quietly. My father explained that they would begin transferring ownership paperwork. My mother talked about keeping the property in the family. Melissa started discussing renovation plans before she technically owned anything. Meanwhile, I kept thinking about a locked filing cabinet in my home office. Inside that cabinet were 12 years of records, canceled checks, tax receipts, bank transfers, property assessments, emails, letters, documents that told a very different story from the one being presented at that dinner table. I hadn't brought any of it with me. I hadn't planned to need it. Until that moment, I genuinely believed my family understood what had happened over the years. I thought they remembered. Apparently they didn't. Or maybe they hoped I wouldn't. The strangest part was that nobody even mentioned me during the discussion. Not once. As if I were just another guest hearing the news for the first time. As if I hadn't spent more than a decade quietly keeping that property alive. As if the house had magically paid for itself. The announcement ended with applause. Actual applause. Melissa cried. My mother cried. My father looked proud. And I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was a plan. A plan that depended entirely on me staying silent. And the truth was, I had already spent 12 years preparing for a moment exactly like this. They just didn't know it yet. Before I tell you what happened next, hit like and subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If you had asked my parents when we were kids whether they had a favorite child, they would have denied it immediately. They would have laughed. They would have said they loved Melissa and me equally. And technically, maybe they believed that. But growing up inside the family felt very different from looking at it from the outside. Melissa was 3 years younger than me. She was charming, outgoing, funny, and naturally good at making people feel sorry for her whenever things went wrong. I was quieter, more organized. The kind of kid teachers described as responsible. Looking back, I think that single word shaped my entire childhood. Responsible. Whenever Melissa forgot something, I was expected to remember it. Whenever Melissa made a mess, I was expected to help clean it. Whenever Melissa got into trouble, I was expected to understand why she couldn't help herself. It started with little things. If Melissa forgot her homework, my mother would spend the evening helping her finish it. If I forgot mine, I got a lecture about being more careful. When Melissa wanted expensive dance lessons, my parents found room in the budget. When I wanted to attend a summer art program, I was told money was tight. At first, I thought that was just how families worked. I didn't realize the pattern until I was older. One Christmas stands out in my memory. I was 15. Melissa was 12. I had spent months saving money from babysitting jobs because I wanted a used camera. Nothing fancy, just something decent enough to learn photography. Christmas morning arrived, and Melissa opened a brand new laptop, the kind that cost more than anything I'd ever owned. When I opened my gifts, I found sweaters, books, and a $20 gift card. I remember sitting there trying not to feel disappointed. Then my father looked at me and said something that stayed with me for years. "You're mature enough to understand. Melissa needs more encouragement. Needs more encouragement." That became the family explanation for everything. Melissa needed encouragement. Melissa needed support. Melissa needed another chance. Meanwhile, I was expected to succeed without help because I was strong. The strange thing was that my grandparents noticed, especially my grandmother. Her name was Eleanor Bennett. Everyone called her Ellie. She was one of those people who could walk into a room and make everyone feel calmer within 5 minutes. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic, but people listened when she spoke. Grandma never openly criticized my parents, at least not in front of us, but she paid attention. When I was 16, she started inviting me over on weekends. Sometimes we'd garden, sometimes we'd cook, sometimes we'd sit on the porch drinking iced tea while she told stories about growing up. Those weekends became my favorite part of the week, not because she spoiled me. Actually, Grandma was probably the most practical person I ever knew. She believed in earning things. She believed in showing up when people needed help. And she believed that actions mattered more than promises. One afternoon, after Melissa had skipped another family gathering because she wanted to go shopping with friends, Grandma said something interesting. "You know, Rachel, being dependable is a gift." I laughed. "It mostly feels like extra work." She smiled. "That's because you're young." Then she looked toward the garden. "The problem with dependable people is that everyone starts expecting them to carry more than their share." At 16, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Years later, I would. My grandfather Frank died when I was 23. A heart attack. Sudden. Unexpected. The entire family gathered for the funeral. Everyone talked about how important family was. Everyone promised to stay close. Everyone promised to help Grandma however she needed. For a few months, they actually tried. My parents visited regularly. Melissa stopped by occasionally. My uncles called. My cousins checked in. Then life happened. At least that was the excuse. Visits became less frequent. Phone calls became shorter. Holidays became the only times everyone saw each other. Grandma stayed in the house alone. At first, she managed fine. The property wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either. The house sat on nearly 4 acres. There were gardens, trees, a detached garage, a workshop Grandpa had built decades earlier. Maintaining all of it required money and energy. As the years passed, both became harder to find. Grandma lived primarily on retirement income and savings. She wasn't poor, but she wasn't wealthy either. Then property taxes started climbing. Every year they seemed to increase. At first it wasn't a crisis. Then the increases became harder to absorb. Around that same time, maintenance costs started piling up. A leaking roof, a broken water heater, electrical repairs. The kinds of expenses homeowners understand all too well. Individually manageable, together overwhelming. I was 26 when Grandma first mentioned being worried. We were sitting in her kitchen reviewing bills. She looked embarrassed, almost ashamed. "I hate talking about money," she said. "You don't have to. I know." She folded a property tax notice. "But I think I need to start making decisions." I asked whether she'd spoken to my parents. She sighed. That sigh told me everything. Apparently she had. My parents said they were stretched thin. Melissa had recently moved into a new apartment and needed help furnishing it. Dad had vehicle payments. Mom had medical expenses. There was always something. Always a reason. Always an explanation. Never a solution. A few weeks later, I asked my father directly, "How much does Grandma need?" He looked uncomfortable. "She'll figure it out." I remember staring at him. "That's your mother." He shrugged. "We all have financial responsibilities." That conversation bothered me for weeks. Not because my parents couldn't afford everything. I understood money wasn't unlimited. What bothered me was how casually everyone dismissed the problem. The same family that talked endlessly about supporting one another suddenly disappeared when actual support was required. Meanwhile, Melissa continued receiving help. My parents paid part of her rent more than once. They helped with car repairs. They covered credit card debt at least twice. Nobody questioned those expenses. Nobody called them burdens. But helping Grandma keep her home? That somehow became complicated. The first property tax payment I made was supposed to be temporary. That's important. I didn't volunteer to take responsibility forever. I simply wanted to help her through a difficult year. I had recently received a promotion. I wasn't wealthy, but I was financially stable. So I wrote a check. Grandma cried when I handed it to her. I hated that. Not because she was grateful, because she felt guilty. She kept insisting she'd pay me back. I told her not to worry about it. The following year, another tax bill arrived. The year after that, another one. Then another. And somehow, without any formal discussion, everyone assumed I would keep handling it. Nobody asked. Nobody offered alternatives. They simply expected it. When the roof needed repairs, I contributed. When the furnace failed, I helped. When emergency plumbing work became necessary, I paid part of the bill. Every payment generated records, receipts, checks, bank transfers. At first, I kept them because I was organized. Later, I kept them because something felt wrong. Every time I helped, family members thanked me. But there was always something strange about those conversations. The gratitude felt temporary, like they viewed my help as an obligation rather than a sacrifice, as though I were simply doing what was expected. One Thanksgiving, about 7 years before Grandma died, my Uncle Brian actually said it out loud. We were discussing property maintenance. He laughed and pointed toward me. "Well, Rachel always handles that stuff." Everyone nodded, including my parents. Nobody seemed to notice how bizarre that sounded. Not Grandma, not her children, not the people who would eventually claim emotional ownership of the property. Just me, and judging by the look on Grandma's face, maybe her too. That evening she pulled me aside after dinner. "Keep your records," I frowned. "My records? Everything. Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked toward the dining room where everyone was laughing, because memories change when money gets involved. At the time, I thought she was being cautious. I had no idea how important those words would become, or how much trouble my family was already planning to create. For a while, things stayed relatively predictable. Grandma would call when something needed attention. I'd drive over after work or on weekends. We'd handle whatever problem had come up, and life would move on. But around 6 years before she died, I started noticing changes. Not with Grandma, with everyone else. People who hadn't shown much interest in the property suddenly became interested, very interested. It started with my mother. One afternoon, while helping Grandma organize paperwork, I heard a car pull into the driveway. A few minutes later, Mom walked through the front door carrying a coffee and smiling like she hadn't missed a single weekly visit. The problem was that I hadn't seen her there in months, maybe longer. She hugged Grandma, asked about her health, talked about family news. Then, almost casually, she asked a question. "Have you ever thought about what will happen with the property eventually?" The room went quiet. Grandma kept sorting papers. "I own it," Mom laughed. "You know what I mean?" Grandma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she carefully placed a document into a folder. Then she looked up. "When I decide something, I'll let everyone know." Mom smiled again. But it looked forced. The conversation moved on, at least on the surface. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because discussing estate planning was unusual. People get older. Families have those conversations. What bothered me was the timing. Mom hadn't been visiting regularly. She hadn't been helping financially, yet suddenly she seemed interested in what would happen to the house someday. Over the next year, similar conversations kept appearing. Different relatives, different wording, same topic. the property, the land, the future. Always the future. Never the present. Never the taxes due next month. Never the repair bills. Never the maintenance. Only ownership. One afternoon, Melissa surprised everyone by showing up. That alone was unusual. At the time, she lived nearly 40 minutes away and rarely visited. Grandma was happy to see her. So was I. For about 10 minutes. Then Melissa started talking. You know, she said while looking out the kitchen window, this place would be amazing with some updates. Grandma smiled politely. What kind of updates? Melissa launched into a full renovation plan. New floors, expanded kitchen, landscaping changes, wall removals, paint colors. By the time she finished, she'd essentially redesigned the entire house. Grandma listened quietly. Then she asked one question. Who would pay for all that? Melissa laughed. Oh, someday. That word again. Someday. Always someday. Never today. Never when the bills arrived. Never when work needed to be done. After Melissa left, Grandma shook her head. What? She smiled sadly. People spend money they don't own surprisingly easily. That conversation stayed with me, mostly because it felt like Grandma understood exactly what was happening. And she didn't like it. A year later, things became more obvious. Melissa's marriage started falling apart. At first, nobody talked about it openly. Then details began spreading through the family. Financial stress, arguments, debt, eventually a separation, then divorce. I genuinely felt bad for her. Whatever frustrations I had about favoritism, she was still my sister. Divorce is painful, especially when money is involved. But something changed after that. Melissa began spending more time with our parents. And our parents began talking about her future constantly. How hard things were, how expensive housing had become, how unfair life could be. Then one evening during a family dinner, my father said something that immediately got my attention. Melissa had stepped away from the table. Dad leaned forward. You know, if she ever inherited Grandma's place, she'd finally have some stability. The comment was directed at no one in particular. Yet everyone heard it. Everyone except Grandma. She was in the kitchen. I remember looking across the table at Mom. She nodded. As if they had discussed this before. Maybe they had. I kept my mouth shut. But a warning bell started ringing in my head. Because nobody was talking about what Grandma wanted. They were talking about what Melissa needed. Those are very different conversations. Over the next 18 months, pressure began appearing from multiple directions. Not openly. Not aggressively. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. Whenever a major expense came up, relatives would call me. Not Grandma, me. Almost as if they viewed me as the property's financial manager. A roof repair estimate arrived. They called me. Property taxes increased. They called me. Storm damage required cleanup. They called me. Yet when I suggested sharing costs, the conversations became awkward. Everyone had reasons. Everyone had limitations. Everyone had financial struggles. Meanwhile, I knew for a fact that several of them were taking expensive vacations, buying new vehicles, renovating their own homes. The issue wasn't inability. The issue was priority. Grandma's house ranked very low on everyone's priority list, at least until ownership entered the discussion. Then came the secret meetings. I didn't know they were happening at first. I only discovered them accidentally. One Saturday, I arrived at Grandma's house carrying groceries. Several vehicles were parked outside. My parents' car, Melissa's SUV, my uncle Brian's truck, a cousin's sedan. Everyone was inside. I hadn't been invited. The moment I walked through the door, conversation stopped. Completely. Not slowed. Stopped. That kind of silence tells you everything. People exchanged quick glances. My mother smiled. Oh, Rachel, we didn't know you were coming. I looked around. Apparently, neither had the groceries in my hands. Grandma emerged from another room. The look on her face was enough. She wasn't happy, not angry, tired. The meeting broke up shortly afterward. Nobody explained what they'd been discussing. Nobody offered details. They simply left. That evening, I asked Grandma directly, "What was that about?" She stared out the window for several seconds. Then she sighed. Everyone suddenly cares about planning. Planning what? My future. Something about her tone made my stomach tighten. A few weeks later, another problem appeared, one of the largest property tax increases yet. The amount wasn't impossible, but it was significant. Grandma sat at her kitchen table staring at the notice. I hate asking you. I sat down across from her. You aren't asking. She looked at me. Aren't I? The truth was, she wasn't. Because by then, everyone already assumed I would help, including me. I hated realizing that. Not because I regretted helping. I didn't. I'd do it again. What frustrated me was how normal it had become, how invisible it had become. A decade of support had somehow transformed into expectation. Nobody acknowledged the sacrifice anymore. It was simply part of the family system. Rachel handles it. Rachel pays. Rachel figures it out. Then one night, something happened that changed everything. I was helping Grandma file paperwork, mostly tax documents, insurance forms, routine things. As I organized folders, I noticed several envelopes from attorneys. Not one attorney, multiple. Most were unopened. Some had notes attached. I asked whether she needed help reviewing them. Grandma became unusually serious. Then she said something I'd never heard before. There's more going on than you realize. I stopped sorting papers. What do you mean? She looked toward the hallway, as though making sure nobody else was nearby. Then she lowered her voice. I think some people have already decided what happens after I'm gone. The room suddenly felt smaller. Because for the first time, Grandma wasn't talking about possibilities. She was talking about certainty. And judging by her expression, whatever she had discovered worried her far more than it worried me, at least for now. I didn't push Grandma that night, partly because she looked exhausted, but mostly because I could tell she was deciding how much she wanted to tell me. Grandma was never secretive by nature. If something needed to be said, she usually said it. The fact that she hesitated told me whatever was happening was serious. For the next few weeks, I waited. Life continued normally on the surface. I went to work, paid bills, checked on Grandma, handled another minor repair at the house. But I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Some people have already decided what happens after I'm gone. The more I thought about it, the more it explained things. The sudden visits, the conversations about the property, the secret family meetings, Melissa's growing interest in the house, my parents constantly talking about her financial future. The pieces fit together a little too well. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Grandma called me. Her voice sounded calm. Can you take Friday off? I laughed. That's a strange way to start a conversation. Can you? Probably. Why? I need you to come somewhere with me. Where? You'll find out. Then she hung up. Typical Grandma. Friday arrived. I picked her up around 10 in the morning. Instead of directing me toward a restaurant or doctor's office, she gave me an address downtown. An office building. 4 stories. Brick exterior. Professional looking. When we parked, I read the sign near the entrance. Law Offices of Richard Harmon. I looked at Grandma. She simply nodded. Come on. Inside, we were greeted immediately. Not like first-time visitors. Like people who were expected. A receptionist smiled. Good morning, Mrs. Bennett. That told me everything. This wasn't a new appointment. She'd been there before. Several times, apparently. A few minutes later, we were escorted into a conference room. Then a man in his 60s entered carrying a folder. Richard Harmon, Grandma's attorney. The next 2 hours changed the way I saw my family forever. At first, the meeting seemed routine. Estate planning, property records, legal documents. Things older adults often organize. Then Mr. Harmon opened a folder and slid several papers across the table. Your grandmother wanted you present because some matters directly involve you. I looked at Grandma. She nodded. Just listen. So I listened, and what I heard left me speechless. Over the previous several years, multiple relatives had contacted the attorney's office, not to help Grandma, not to clarify her wishes, not to discuss her care, to discuss the property. Specifically, they wanted information about what would happen to the house. Some inquiries were innocent enough, others weren't. One relative had apparently asked whether ownership could be transferred before death. Another wanted to know whether estate decisions could be challenged. Someone else had requested information about future inheritance expectations. The attorney couldn't legally reveal details to them, but he could document the requests, and he had. Every single one. The deeper we went into the records, the worse it became. Certain conversations involved my parents. Others involved Melissa. Some involved both. None of them had been authorized by Grandma. None of them reflected her wishes. Yet they had happened. Repeatedly. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. Finally, I looked at Grandma. "Why didn't you tell me?" She smiled sadly. "Because I wanted proof first." Then Mr. Harmon produced another folder. This one was much thicker. "Now let's discuss something else." The folder contained copies of financial records. My financial records. At first, I didn't understand. Then I recognized the documents. Property tax payments, repair invoices, maintenance expenses, canceled checks, bank transfers. Every payment I had ever made toward the property. My eyes widened. I looked at Grandma, then at the attorney, then back at the documents. "How do you have these?" Grandma smiled. "You aren't the only person who keeps records." Apparently she had been documenting everything too. For years, not because she expected conflict, because she believed facts mattered. The attorney pointed toward a summary sheet. The total amount nearly made me choke. 12 years of taxes, repairs, emergency maintenance, insurance contributions, miscellaneous property expenses. The number was far larger than I had ever calculated. Because I had never added everything together. I handled problems individually, 1 year at a time, one bill at a time. Seeing it all combined was shocking. Then came the real surprise. Mr. Harmon opened a final folder. This is the important part. Inside was a signed statement prepared by Grandma. Not a will. Something different. A detailed written explanation of her intentions. It described the property, its history, its maintenance, the financial reality of keeping it. And most importantly, it documented who had actually preserved it. Page after page. Names. Dates. Records. Facts. No emotion. No anger. Just evidence. Near the end, one paragraph stood out. I still remember it almost word for word. It stated that any future decisions regarding the property should acknowledge the person who had carried the financial burden necessary to preserve it. Not the people who discussed it, not the people who expected it, the person who protected it. I stared at the page for several seconds, then looked up. "Grandma," she interrupted gently. "I know." I could see tears forming in her eyes. "I never wanted you to carry that responsibility. I didn't know what to say, because the truth was complicated. Part of me felt honored, part of me felt heartbroken, and part of me felt angry. Not at her, at everyone else. For years I had assumed they simply weren't paying attention. Now I was beginning to suspect something worse. Maybe they had been paying attention all along. Maybe they just assumed it wouldn't matter. Then Mr. Harmon revealed the final piece. The thing that changed everything. The house wasn't nearly as vulnerable as my family believed. Grandma had already structured her estate plans carefully, extremely carefully. Certain protections were already in place. Specific instructions existed. Documentation existed. Records existed. And every major decision had been reviewed legally. In simple terms, the plans my family seemed to be making behind closed doors were based on assumptions. Dangerous assumptions. The attorney didn't sound angry. He sounded almost amused. Like he'd seen situations like this before. Families often become confident when discussing assets they don't actually control. When the meeting ended, I walked Grandma back to the car. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me all day. "Do Mom and Dad know any of this?" Grandma shook her head. "No! What about Melissa? No! Why not?" She stared through the windshield, then gave an answer I'd think about for years. Because people reveal who they are when they believe nobody is watching. The drive home felt surreal. Everything looked normal. Traffic lights, restaurants, gas stations. Ordinary Friday afternoon. Yet my understanding of the family had completely changed. The strange thing wasn't discovering the truth. The strange thing was realizing Grandma already knew exactly how this story would probably end, and she had spent years quietly preparing for it. Before I move on, let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered a secret that completely changed the way you saw your family? Because after that meeting, I couldn't look at mine the same way again. And what happened next proved Grandma had been right about far more than either of us realized. After the meeting with Mr. Harmon, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call my parents. I didn't question Melissa. I didn't mention the attorney. I didn't even tell my husband, Mark, everything right away. For almost 2 weeks, I simply thought. That may sound strange, but I needed time to process what I'd learned. For years, I had believed my family was careless. Now I had evidence suggesting something more deliberate, not necessarily malicious, but deliberate. There was a difference. People can ignore responsibilities without bad intentions. What worried me was that certain family members seemed to be making plans based on assets they neither owned nor maintained, and they were doing it while acting as if those plans were already guaranteed. The more I thought about it, the more dangerous that mindset became. Because people who believe something belongs to them often react badly when they discover it doesn't. Grandma, meanwhile, acted almost unchanged. She still gardened, still baked, still watched old movies in the evenings. But I noticed something new. She seemed relieved. Not happy. Relieved. As though finally sharing information with me had removed a burden she'd been carrying alone. A few weeks after our meeting with Mr. Harmon, she invited me over for lunch. Halfway through sandwiches, she asked a question. Do you know why I wanted you involved? I assumed the answer was obvious, because I've been helping with the property. She shook her head. Partly. Then she pointed at me. But mostly because you pay attention. That answer surprised me, she continued. Most people only notice what they want to notice. I didn't respond. She smiled. You notice what actually happens. Looking back, that was probably the greatest compliment she ever gave me. Because she was right. I wasn't smarter than the rest of the family. I wasn't more successful. I simply paid attention. And paying attention was about to become very important. Over the following months, I began quietly organizing everything. Not because anyone instructed me to. Because experience told me records matter. Especially when memories become convenient. Every property tax payment, every maintenance invoice, every contractor estimate, every bank transfer, every email, every text message discussing expenses. I scanned documents, created backups, stored copies in multiple locations. Nothing dramatic, nothing secretive, just organized. If someone had looked over my shoulder, they would have assumed I was handling routine paperwork. In reality, I was building a timeline, one that stretched back more than a decade. And the timeline revealed patterns that became harder to ignore. For example, whenever major expenses appeared, certain relatives vanished. Whenever discussions about future ownership appeared, those same relatives returned. The pattern repeated over and over, year after year. The consistency was almost impressive. Around that time, Melissa's financial situation became worse. Not publicly, at least not at first. But information has a way of traveling through families. A missed mortgage payment here, credit card issues there, legal expenses from the divorce. Nothing catastrophic individually. Together, they painted a troubling picture. One evening, my mother called me unexpectedly. We talked about ordinary things for a few minutes. Then she shifted the conversation. Melissa's having a difficult time. I already knew that. Okay. She's doing her best. Of course. There was a pause. Then Mom said something interesting. You've always been fortunate financially. Fortunate. I almost laughed. I'd spent years working overtime, budgeting carefully, skipping vacations, delaying purchases, but somehow that became fortune. I let her continue. You know, not everyone gets the same opportunities. There it was, the familiar family narrative. Rachel succeeds because life is easier for Rachel. Melissa struggles because life is harder for Melissa. The countless decisions that contributed to each outcome never entered the conversation. Only the results mattered. I changed the subject. But afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because the groundwork was already being laid. The story was being prepared. Melissa needed help. Melissa deserved stability. Melissa had suffered. And somewhere in the background sat Grandma's house, waiting. A solution to problems nobody wanted to solve themselves. Several months later, another strange event occurred. I arrived at Grandma's house to find Melissa there. Again, unusual. Even more unusual, she seemed irritated. The moment I entered, conversation stopped. Not for the first time. By then, I recognized the pattern. Melissa left shortly afterward. As soon as her car disappeared down the driveway, I looked at Grandma. What was that about? Grandma rubbed her forehead. More future planning. The way she said it told me everything. I sat down across from her. What exactly are they asking for? She hesitated, then answered. They want certainty? About the house? She nodded. And? A faint smile appeared. I told them certainty belongs to the owner. That answer made me laugh. Grandma laughed too. But underneath the humor, something serious existed. Pressure was increasing, not openly, not aggressively, but steadily, like water wearing away stone. Then came another meeting with Mr. Harmon. This one happened about a year before Grandma passed away. By then her health had begun declining more noticeably. Nothing dramatic, just age. The natural slowing that eventually comes for everyone. During that meeting, the attorney reviewed several legal protections already in place. I won't pretend I understood every detail. Lawyers have a language of their own, but I understood the important parts. Grandma's wishes were documented. Her financial records were documented. My contributions were documented. And perhaps most importantly, attempts to misrepresent those facts would face significant obstacles. The attorney wasn't creating revenge plans. He wasn't helping anyone punish relatives. His goal was simple. Protect the truth. That phrase stuck with me. Protect the truth. Because truth often loses against confidence. The loudest person in a room frequently sounds correct, especially when nobody has documentation. Fortunately, documentation existed. Lots of it. As the months passed, I continued preparing quietly. Not because I expected a fight, because I expected confusion. At least that's what I told myself. Deep down, however, I suspected something else. I suspected there would eventually be a confrontation, not a screaming match, not some dramatic movie scene, a collision between assumptions and facts. And facts usually win only when someone is willing to present them. Then Grandma passed away. The call came early on a Tuesday morning. Even though we'd known her health was declining, the loss hit hard. Some people leave behind a space nobody can fill. Grandma was one of those people. The funeral was beautiful, sad, peaceful. Family members shared stories. Friends attended. Neighbors came. For a brief moment, everyone seemed united. The old tensions disappeared, or at least they appeared to. I stood beside Melissa during part of the service. We cried together. Whatever conflicts existed, grief overshadowed them, at least temporarily. But funerals have a strange way of revealing people's priorities. Some focus on memories, others focus on logistics, and a surprising number focus on inheritance. Within 2 weeks, conversations started, small at first, then larger. Who would handle the property? What would happen to the land? What did Grandma want? Questions multiplied rapidly. The problem was that many people weren't actually asking questions. They were making predictions. Predictions that sounded suspiciously like wishes. Then one afternoon my father called. His tone was cheerful. Too cheerful. Family dinner next Sunday. I immediately felt uneasy. What for? We need to discuss some things. What things? There was a brief pause. Then he said something that made every warning bell in my head start ringing. Future plans. The moment he said those words, I knew. Not exactly what was coming, but close enough. The assumptions were about to become public. The plans were about to become official. And the people making them still had absolutely no idea what Grandma had already done behind the scenes. Before I tell you about that dinner, hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my position? Would you have warned the family beforehand? Or would you have waited and let the truth reveal itself when the time came? Because that's exactly the decision I was facing. The Sunday dinner took place 3 weeks after Grandma's funeral. Looking back, that's probably what bothered me most. Not the announcement itself, the timing. 3 weeks. That was all it took for certain family members to shift from mourning Grandma to discussing what they planned to do with her property. I arrived a few minutes early, partly out of habit, partly because I wanted time to observe. My parents were hosting. Several relatives had already arrived. Melissa was there. My uncle Brian, his wife, a couple of cousins. Everyone seemed unusually cheerful. Not funeral cheerful. Celebration cheerful. That immediately made me suspicious. I walked into the dining room and noticed folders sitting on the table. Several folders. My father saw me looking. He smiled. "We've been getting organized." That phrase didn't make me feel any better. Dinner itself was almost normal. People talked about work, kids, summer plans, television shows, the usual family topics. But beneath every conversation, I felt tension, anticipation, like everyone was waiting for the real reason they were there. Eventually, plates were cleared. Coffee was poured. My father stood. And then it began. He thanked everyone for coming, talked about family, talked about Grandma's legacy, talked about keeping loved ones connected. It sounded like a speech he'd rehearsed. Then he finally reached the point. As everyone knows, Mom loved this family. Several people nodded. She always wanted us to take care of each other. More nodding. And after discussing things carefully, we've decided the best path forward. We've decided. Not Grandma. Not the estate. Not the attorney. We. I remained silent. Dad looked toward Melissa. She lowered her eyes modestly. Then he smiled. "The family property will be going to Melissa." Applause immediately broke out around the table. Actual applause. Just like I'd later described to friends. People genuinely believed they were witnessing a settled decision. Melissa began crying. My mother hugged her. Several relatives congratulated her. One cousin actually said, "Grandma would be so happy." That comment almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because the certainty behind it was incredible. Nobody had seen the documents. Nobody had spoken with the attorney. Nobody knew what Grandma had arranged. Yet everyone acted like the matter was already finished. For several minutes, I simply watched, observed, listened. The conversation quickly moved beyond ownership. Melissa discussed renovation ideas. Again, expanded kitchen, updated bathrooms, landscaping changes, a new deck. The same plans she'd been describing for years. Only now she spoke as though they were inevitable. My mother joined in. Dad joined in. Other relatives offered suggestions. The property had apparently become a group project. Meanwhile, nobody mentioned taxes, maintenance, expenses, responsibility, the actual costs of ownership. Only dreams. Eventually, my father looked toward me. "Rachel, you haven't said much." The room grew quiet. Every face turned in my direction. I smiled. "I've mostly been listening." Dad nodded. "Well, we'd love your support." Support. Interesting choice of word. I set down my coffee cup, then asked a simple question. "Who made the decision?" Several people exchanged glances. Dad answered immediately. "We did," I nodded. "Who is we?" His smile faded slightly. "The family." I looked around the room. The entire family? No one answered. That wasn't surprising, because nobody wanted to define exactly who had authority to make the decision. Dad cleared his throat. "We've all discussed it." "With whom?" More silence. The confidence around the table began weakening, just slightly, enough for me to notice. Finally, Mom spoke. "Rachel, what are you getting at?" I kept my voice calm. "I'm trying to understand the process." Melissa sighed dramatically. That was familiar. Whenever uncomfortable questions appeared, she often acted as though the questions themselves were the problem. "It's not complicated," she said. "The house stays in the family." I nodded again. "That sounds nice." "It is nice. Who owns it right now?" The room became noticeably quieter. Melissa frowned. "The estate. Exactly." Nobody spoke. I continued. "Has the estate been settled?" Dad shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet." "Have you met with Mr. Harmon?" The moment I mentioned the attorney's name, several expressions changed, especially my parents. That reaction told me something important. They knew exactly who he was. Dad answered carefully. "Not recently." "Has he told you the property is being transferred to Melissa?" "No." The confidence in the room dropped another level. "Not dramatically. Just enough." Then Uncle Brian jumped in. "Come on, Rachel. Everyone knows what your grandmother would have wanted." I turned toward him. "Do they?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because unlike emotional statements, factual questions often require actual answers. At that moment, I noticed Melissa growing frustrated. This wasn't following the script she'd expected. Neither was what happened next. I reached into my bag and removed a folder. Not a dramatic gesture. Just paperwork. Simple paperwork. The kind I'd spent years organizing. The room watched silently. My father looked concerned now. Not angry. Concerned. I opened the folder, then placed several documents on the table. Property tax records, year after year, page after page. I slid them toward the center. "Can someone tell me whose name appears on these payments?" Nobody moved. Nobody answered. Eventually, Uncle Brian picked up a page, then another, then another. His expression changed. Mom leaned forward. Dad followed. Melissa looked confused. "What is this?" I answered calmly. "Property taxes." The room remained silent. I continued. 12 years of property taxes. More silence. Then I asked another question. "How many of those payments came from Melissa?" Melissa's face reddened. "What's your point?" "My point is simple." I turned another page, then another. Repair invoices. Heating system replacement. Roof repairs. Plumbing emergencies. Insurance contributions. Document after document. Fact after fact. No opinions. No accusations. Just records. For the first time all evening, nobody interrupted. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Because facts are difficult to argue with when they're sitting directly in front of you. Melissa folded her arms. "I never asked you to do that." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." That answer seemed to surprise her. Because it was true. I hadn't helped Grandma for recognition, or leverage, or ownership. I helped because she needed it. The room remained quiet. Then Dad finally spoke. "Rachel, nobody's denying you've helped." The wording caught my attention immediately. Nobody's denying. Meaning the evidence was already impossible to ignore. Good. That saved time. I nodded. "I'm glad." Then I removed another document. This one changed everything. A copy of Grandma's signed statement prepared with the attorney. Not the entire document. Just enough. Enough to establish its existence. Enough to establish intent. The moment several relatives recognized legal letterhead, expressions shifted again. Now, concern became anxiety. Real anxiety. And that's when I realized the confrontation was finally reaching the point Grandma had predicted years earlier. The point where assumptions collide with reality. Before I tell you what happened when they read that document, tell me in the comments. Have you ever watched someone become absolutely confident about something they never actually owned? Because what happened next was the moment my family's entire plan started falling apart. The room stayed quiet for several seconds after I placed the document on the table. Nobody reached for it immediately. It's funny how people react when they think something might contain information they don't want to hear. A minute earlier, everyone had been eager to discuss the future. Now suddenly, nobody seemed eager to read paperwork. Finally, my Uncle Brian picked it up. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. The confidence disappeared from his face almost immediately. Then he handed it to my father. Dad read more slowly. By the second paragraph, the color had drained from his face. Mom leaned over his shoulder. Melissa watched nervously. "What does it say?" she asked. Neither parent answered right away. That alone was revealing, because if the document supported their position, they would have announced it immediately. Instead, they kept reading. And the longer they read, the more uncomfortable they looked. Eventually, Melissa lost patience. She grabbed the papers herself. I watched her eyes move across the page, then stop, then move back and reread a section. The room remained completely silent. No applause now. No celebration. Just paperwork. Just facts. Just the truth. And the truth was proving far less convenient than the fantasy everyone had been enjoying 30 minutes earlier. Melissa finally looked up. "What is this supposed to mean?" I answered carefully. "It's a written statement prepared by Grandma and her attorney. That doesn't decide anything." "No," I nodded. "It doesn't." That response caught her off guard, because she expected an argument. Instead, I was agreeing with her. The document alone didn't decide everything. The estate process still existed. Legal procedures still existed. But the statement revealed intent. And intent mattered, especially when supported by years of documentation. Dad cleared his throat. "Rachel, yes? Why are you bringing this up now?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because of the irony. They had just announced ownership plans in front of the entire family. Yet somehow I was the one accused of choosing the wrong time. I looked around the table. Because everyone is discussing Grandma's wishes. No one responded. So I thought her actual wishes might be relevant. That landed harder than I expected. Mom looked down. Brian stared at the documents. Several cousins suddenly became fascinated by their coffee cups. The atmosphere had completely changed. Then Melissa said something that revealed more than she intended. "Grandma always loved me." The room went still. I nodded. Of course she did. Then why would she do this? There it was. The assumption underneath everything. Love equals inheritance. Love equals ownership. Love equals reward. I shook my head gently. "Those aren't the same thing," Melissa frowned. "What does that mean?" I took a slow breath, then answered honestly. "It means Grandma loving you and Grandma trusting you with the property are two separate issues." That statement hit like a hammer. Because deep down, everyone understood it. Parents love children who make terrible decisions. Spouses love partners they can't trust with money. Love and responsibility aren't identical. Never have been. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, I actually felt bad. Not because she was right, because I genuinely think she'd convinced herself the house was already hers. Maybe my parents had encouraged that belief. Maybe she'd built it herself. Either way, she believed it. And now reality was arriving. Slowly. Painfully. Publicly. Then my father tried a different approach. "Let's be reasonable," I nodded. "Okay, nobody's trying to take advantage of anyone." That statement hung in the air. Not because it was convincing, because nobody seemed sure they believed it. Dad continued, "We just want what's best for the family." Again, that sounded wonderful. Until you asked a simple question. Which family member? I asked exactly that. What's best for which family member? He hesitated. Melissa looked away. And suddenly the entire discussion became impossible to ignore. Because the answer was obvious. The proposed plan primarily benefited one person. Melissa. Not Grandma. Not the estate. Not the broader family. Melissa. That realization spread through the room. You could almost feel it. Nobody said it aloud. They didn't need to. Then I pulled out one final document, the summary sheet. The one listing 12 years of contributions, property taxes, repairs, maintenance, emergency expenses, everything. The total amount sat at the bottom, large, uncomfortable, impossible to dismiss. I slid it across the table. My father stared at the number, then looked at me, then back at the paper. For the first time all evening, he seemed genuinely shocked. "That's accurate?" "Every dollar is documented." Mom covered her mouth. Brian muttered something under his breath. A cousin quietly whispered, Wow. Melissa didn't say anything because there wasn't much to say. The records spoke for themselves, and those records exposed something nobody wanted to discuss. The house everyone wanted to inherit still existed because someone had continuously invested in keeping it alive, year after year, bill after bill, without complaint, without promises of repayment, without ownership guarantees. Then came the moment everything finally collapsed. My father looked directly at me. "What exactly are you saying?" The question was sincere. He genuinely didn't understand, or maybe he finally realized he needed clarity. Either way, I gave it to him. I'm saying nobody gets to pretend history didn't happen. Silence. I'm saying Grandma's wishes matter. More silence. I'm saying facts matter. The room felt frozen. Then I added one final sentence. And I'm saying Mr. Harmon already knows all of this. That changed everything. Immediately. The attorney's name carried weight now. Not because he was powerful, because he represented documentation, process, evidence. Things much harder to manipulate than family conversations. Mom looked alarmed. Dad looked defeated. Brian suddenly seemed eager to leave. And Melissa looked lost. Not angry. Lost. As though the future she'd imagined was disappearing in real time. Then she asked the question nobody else had been brave enough to ask. "So who gets the house?" I looked at her, then at everyone else, and answered honestly. "I don't know." That stunned the room, because they expected me to claim it, to demand it, to announce victory. But that had never been my goal. I wasn't there to take the house. I was there to protect the truth. The attorney would handle the estate. The documents would speak. Grandma's wishes would be followed. That was all I'd ever wanted. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then my father slowly sat down. The meeting was over. Not officially, but emotionally. The celebration had vanished. The assumptions had vanished, and the fantasy that ownership could simply be declared at a family dinner had vanished too. What remained was reality. And reality was about to become very expensive for some people, because the weeks that followed brought consequences none of them had expected. The strangest thing about the dinner wasn't the confrontation itself. It was what happened afterward. Or more accurately, what didn't happen. Nobody yelled. Nobody stormed out. Nobody flipped tables or made dramatic speeches. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, people went home. And then reality started arriving one letter at a time. The first week after the dinner was quiet, almost suspiciously quiet. My parents didn't call. Melissa didn't text. Even relatives who normally shared family gossip seemed unusually silent. I suspected everyone was waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for the attorney. Waiting to discover whether the documents I mentioned were as significant as they appeared. The answer came quickly. About 10 days later, official estate communications began reaching family members. Not detailed explanations, just notifications regarding meetings, procedures, and legal processes. Enough to make one thing clear. The estate would be administered according to documented instructions, not according to family assumptions. That distinction mattered. A lot. The reactions varied. Some relatives accepted it immediately. Others became frustrated. A few became angry. But anger doesn't change paperwork, and paperwork was suddenly everywhere. One afternoon, my cousin Lisa called. She wasn't involved in any of the property discussions, which made her one of the few people I trusted to speak honestly. I had no idea. I knew exactly what she meant. Most people didn't. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I laughed softly. "Would anyone have listened?" There was a long pause. Then she admitted something interesting. Probably not. And she was right. For years, the family had built a narrative. Melissa needed help. Melissa deserved support. Melissa would eventually get the house. Once people repeat a story often enough, they start treating it as fact. Even when no evidence exists, the estate process slowly dismantled that story. Not dramatically, methodically, the way facts usually do. Over the following months, additional information became available. Documents were reviewed. Records were verified. Financial histories were examined. Every time someone tried to simplify the situation into a single emotional argument, another piece of documentation appeared. And documentation has a frustrating habit of refusing to care about feelings. One consequence arrived sooner than expected. Several relatives who had enthusiastically supported the transfer began distancing themselves from the idea. Not because their opinions changed, because responsibility became part of the conversation. The moment maintenance costs entered the discussion, enthusiasm dropped noticeably. The moment future tax obligations appeared, enthusiasm dropped even further. Funny how that works. People love discussing benefits. Responsibilities attract fewer volunteers. Meanwhile, Melissa's situation became increasingly complicated. Again, I don't want to paint her as a villain. Life had genuinely been difficult for her. The divorce hurt her financially. Housing costs were high. She had legitimate struggles. The problem wasn't that she needed help. The problem was believing someone else's property was the solution. When that possibility disappeared, she faced reality again, and reality required difficult choices. Several months after the dinner, she called me. Honestly, I almost didn't answer. Not because I hated her, because I didn't know what kind of conversation we were about to have. To my surprise, she sounded exhausted. Not angry, just tired. We talked awkwardly for a few minutes. Then she finally addressed the obvious issue. I really thought the house would be mine. I didn't respond immediately. What could I say? She continued. Mom and Dad made it sound certain. There it was. The sentence I'd suspected for years. Certain. Not possible. Not likely. Certain. Somewhere along the way, my parents had apparently transformed hopes into expectations. Maybe they believed it themselves. Maybe they were trying to comfort her. Maybe they simply convinced themselves they knew what Grandma wanted. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Melissa built plans around something nobody had actually promised her. For the first time in years, I heard genuine vulnerability in her voice. Not manipulation. Not self-pity. Just disappointment. And honestly, I felt bad for her. Not because she was entitled to the house, because she had trusted people who should have known better. Our conversation ended politely. Not warmly, but politely. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years. My parents handled things differently. Initially, they tried defending their position. They insisted they were acting out of concern for Melissa. They insisted they believed they understood Grandma's wishes. Maybe they even believed that. The problem was that believing something doesn't make it true. Eventually, the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. Grandma's records, the attorney's records, financial records, written instructions. The paper trail stretched back years. There was simply no room left for alternative versions of history. Then came the most painful consequence. Not legal, emotional. Trust. Or more accurately, the loss of it. I stopped sharing certain things with my parents, not out of revenge, out of caution. When people spend years making decisions without including you, trust changes. When they minimize your contributions while planning around your sacrifices, trust changes. When they confidently tell others what a loved one wanted without actually knowing, trust changes. The relationship didn't end, but it became different, more distant, more careful, less automatic. I think they noticed. One evening, Dad called. The conversation wandered through ordinary topics for a while. Then he surprised me. I should have handled things differently. The statement was small, simple, but significant. My father wasn't someone who apologized easily. I stayed quiet. He continued. I didn't realize how much you'd done. Part of me wanted to remind him he'd had 12 years to notice. But I didn't, because the point wasn't winning. The point was understanding. And maybe, finally, he understood. A few weeks later, Mom said something similar. Not a full apology, but close. Closer than I'd expected. The truth had finally become impossible to avoid. Not because I forced it on them, because Grandma had documented it, protected it, preserved it. exactly as she'd intended. As for the property itself, the final resolution took time. Estate matters often do. Months passed. Then, more months. Eventually, everything was settled according to the legal framework Grandma had spent years creating. No dramatic courtroom battle. No television-style lawsuit. Just paperwork. Meetings. Signatures. Processes. Reality. The kind of justice that happens quietly. The kind built on preparation rather than revenge. And in the end, that felt appropriate. Because Grandma wasn't interested in punishment. She was interested in fairness. The people who assumed they could control the outcome discovered they couldn't. The people who ignored responsibilities learned those responsibilities mattered. And the truth survived, exactly as she intended. But the most important part of the story wasn't the property. It was what happened afterward. Because once the conflict finally ended, I had to figure out how to live without carrying it. And that turned out to be harder than I expected.